Well, Dr. Mark Paul is an assistant professor at the Blaustein School at Rutgers University and is also a member of the Rutgers Climate Institute. You can see his research and writings everywhere. And I was particularly fascinated by Mark's new book, The Ends of Freedom, Reclaiming America's Lost Promise of Economic Rights. Dr. Mark Paul, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Good morning. It's great to be here today.
It's so great to have you. I was really interested in the ends of freedom, and I was very struck by so many aspects of the book, and I'm excited to get into it. I was really struck about the long history of economic rights through American history. I want to get into that, but if we can take a step back here, you make this distinction as a non-economist myself that I was really interested in between positive and negative freedoms. Can you explain what the difference is between positive and negative freedoms as we think about it here in the United States?
Sure. So, freedom is the most important word in our political discourse here. Yet, it's a word that's been really owned by kind of the far right fraction of our political system for essentially decades now. And it's been associated with this idea of freedom from government. Grover Norquist famously quipped, I want to shrink government down to size where I can strangle it in the bathtub. And that's kind of the notion of freedom that's popular today. People see the "Don't Tread on Me" flag all over the place these days, particularly with the rise of President Trump and his followers, but also with the Tea Party, that came before him. And what this is based on is this notion of negative freedom, freedom from constraint. And that is grounded in the American tradition. It's true. There is a long line of thinking dating back to the Revolution, where the colonists were indeed fighting to restrain the government because the government back then was indeed a monarchy, right? And we were not living in a democracy when this country entered the Revolution. And in fact, the colonists were rebelling against a monarchy and trying to ensure that the monarchy couldn't, unfairly regulate them. But what we've lost is the alternative vision of freedom, and in many respects, a complementary notion of freedom, which is freedom to basic things, which also has a deep and rich history in the American tradition, also dating back to the Revolution, which is this notion that not only are we need to be free from kind of unruly constraint, but we also need to be free to access basic goods and services, free to live actualized lives that are meaningful and dignified. And Jefferson, Jefferson supported this in his statement of, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. People don't just want to be left alone when they enter society. They want to have, rights to basic things. Thomas Paine, perhaps the most radical founder, I think, really articulated this so well in his writings, where he talked about the notion of a citizen's dividend and the need for modern day social security. I mean, he was the original architect of that in many respects. And so for people to be free, it's not that they just need to have minimal constraints, but they actually need to have real options and choices available to them. And this alternative notion of freedom, positive freedom, we can actually then trace forward to the radical Republicans, through the New Deal, to the civil rights movement, and here to the kind of resurgence of, Democrats rediscovering the New Deal here today, where people are understanding that minimal government is not the answer to our problems, particularly when we have a government of the people, for the people, by the people.
Yeah, you go back to that citizens dividend and the thoughts of the founding fathers as you lay out in the book. The whole idea is if you're not guaranteeing these freedoms, then you're going to have a very unstable democracy. Fast forward to 2023, we now have a very unstable democracy, right? And we're seeing instability throughout the United States and through much of the West as we don't have many of these economic rights guaranteed. Let's just focus here on the United States, because that's certainly where the focus of the book is. What economic rights do you think are the most important to secure now to make sure we actually are guaranteeing the freedoms we need to guarantee?
Yeah, so before I dig into the specifics, I just want to note, Roosevelt had this brilliant quote where he said, "Necessitous men are not free men," and he went on to argue that, economic insecurity is precisely what gives rise to fascism and dictators. And that's what we're seeing here again today with people like President Trump kind of capturing of the American working class, at least a segment of the American working class, who are feeling continuously insecure. Like the economy of the past 2 decades has not worked very well for them, and they're understandably frustrated. I think they should be. And so a big part of the program that I put forward is this notion that in order to have a well-functioning democracy, people need not only political rights, not only civil rights, not only reproductive rights, which are increasingly coming under attack today, but they need economic rights. And so what does that mean? That means things like the right to housing, the right to a job, the right to a basic income, essentially ensuring that people have their basic needs met. I mean, we are an incredibly wealthy country. Scarcity is no longer the problem. We can ensure that everybody has their basic needs. And indeed, this will actually result in both a healthier democracy and a more flourishing economy.
Yeah, you talk about in the book how we have extraordinary wealth inequality, which I think many of the listeners of the podcast will be certainly familiar with. But you write about these insecurity multipliers and how this actually exacerbates existing wealth inequality. What are insecurity multipliers?
So, right now we're facing multiple compounding crises. The inequality crisis is but one. And this is a problem that we've been dealing with increasingly since the 1980s, when we became a more and more unequal society. But it's a problem that's reared its head multiple times in American history. 1920s rings a bell, where wealth inequality was just absolutely grotesque. And unfortunately, we're back at those levels here today, living in kind of a second Gilded Age. But inequality is not the only problem we're facing. I mean, this is the climate pod, right? And we are in the midst of a climate crisis. We are facing substantial climate breakdown in the here and now. I mean, when I was a kid, we would always talk about the polar bears, and we would always talk about, the grandchildren and the future generations. But we're increasingly realizing that, extreme weather events are being fueled by climate change, here in the year 2023, and that we need to do something about that. And that as people lack their basic economic needs, the world becomes more unstable. Democracies become more unstable as climate change ramps up, and we see increasing storms that lead to displacement of individuals, that lead to economic hardship and the like. So the climate crisis is just compounding the existing problems we have. The other insecurity multiplier that I talk about is the threat that democracy is facing here in the United States. I mean, I'm deeply concerned about the viability of our democratic institutions right now. I mean, we had a president support essentially an attempted coup back on January 6th. And here he is running for president again. And we have Republicans in the Senate unwilling to disavow him and his behavior. It's really a troubling situation. And, those threats to democracy make the well-being both of the economy and of our political system in serious jeopardy. And when I talk about the well-being of the economy, I want to be careful here, because what I don't just mean is, does GDP go up or down? We're not playing the game of Monopoly here. We're playing the game of life. And what I think we need to care about much more than GDP is human flourishing. And so, what we see is a country where, middle upper class is doing just fine, but the middle lower class is, continuing to live paycheck to paycheck. We still have 40 million Americans in poverty today. This is the same number of people in poverty back in the 1930s, when Roosevelt said, he saw a nation 1/3 ill-clad, 1/3 ill-housed, and 1/3 ill-fed. And, yes, we are a larger nation today. The poverty rate has indeed declined, but we've also become massively richer. And yet here we are still with 40 million Americans unnecessarily living in poverty.
Yeah, and to go to that point of unnecessary poverty, almost 60 years ago, President Johnson creates this commission, which issues a report on scarcity. And among its findings is by 1964, we no longer faced a scarcity problem. Can you talk a little bit more about what you found when you looked back on that report?
Yeah, it's rather shocking because we're constantly told a rising tide lifts all boats, and if only GDP were to continue increasing, we would address our both our poverty problems, but also our economic insecurity problems. Let's remember that a third of Americans today don't even have $400 in their savings account to deal with an emergency expense, and $400 is really nothing. I mean, $400 is not even going to cover an emergency room visit if you have a good health insurance plan, let alone for the quarter of Americans who are uninsured or underinsured. So we're talking about, really folks living paycheck to paycheck on the regular here. So back in, 1964, we're talking here 60 years ago, it was the case that we already had plenty to go around. It wasn't a problem of increasing GDP. It was a problem of distribution. It's a problem of who gets what. And what we've done is we've built an economy with rules that dictate that we continue to allow tens of millions of Americans to live in poverty. It's not because they're not willing to work hard or they're not willing to contribute or they're not, they didn't make the right choices. It's because the system we've set up essentially necessitates keeping people in poverty. That's something that as an economist, I take quite seriously because it's not the only way we can set up the economic system. We can choose to change the rules of the economic system. But it's also something that as a human being, I am just outraged by. Michael Harrington was very influential in my thinking. And he talked about this notion that when somebody is poor, it's not just one aspect of that person's life, it is their life. I mean, poverty just is utterly all consuming. And today, we have behaviorists who study poverty, and they find that, people's ability to make decisions drastically declines. They find that, stress on the body increases dramatically when people are in poverty. I mean, there's just all of these, negative biological effects of poverty that are wreaking havoc on the human body. And Harrington talked about how the only true human reaction can be absolute outrage. And the reason for this outrage is that it's fully preventable. And that is just something that's really hard to live with on a day-to-day basis, knowing that we allow people to go without when that need not be the case.
Oh, and how frustrating to think when you go back to looking at FDR's policies and the New Deal, that we were on pace to make the kind of progress, certainly on the economic side, that could have gotten us to the future which you lay out in terms of economic rights. Now, obviously, as you detail with the New Deal, there was extraordinary amounts of racial inequality that were baked in. But as you write in the book, quote, the natural outgrowths of FDR's policies, today's calls for universal health care, a federal minimum wage increase, or full employment, have received no sincere attempts at the uptake from the Liberal Party, unquote. What are the principles of the New Deal era that seem to be most applicable to what we need to get done today?
Yeah, so Roosevelt, I think, really provided both an economic and moral vision for this country. And I think one of Roosevelt's major failings, of which there are many, I want to be clear, he really failed to stand up, for instance, for true civil rights legislation during his time in the presidency. And I think that is a dark smear on his character and on the nation. But Roosevelt, stood for this idea of cradle to grave security, and this notion that each and every person, needs to be taken care of from birth through death. And in outlining that vision, it wasn't only presenting a moral vision, but it was presenting policies in order to execute that vision and ensure that that became policy reality. And so, we had the New Deal, and we had the vision of the Roosevelt's four freedoms, freedom from want being one of them, which is precisely what the Economic Bill of Rights comes into play. It's to secure that freedom from want that Roosevelt put forward. And unfortunately, the what Roosevelt failed to do was to support Henry Wallace to stay on his ticket as vice presidential candidate in 1944. And instead, conservative Democrats led by the Dixiecrats in the South replaced Wallace with Truman. And Truman was a far more conservative Democrat than Wallace was. And that really was the start of the changing tide for the Democratic Party, shifts substantially towards the right. And so today we have a Democratic Party that is really continuing to fail to live up to the vision of the New Deal, and the vision of really economic security across the board. I mean, I think it's a true failure of the imagination more than anything to think that the best we can do is our marginal tweaks, to improve the 529 college savings plan, or to slightly subsidize private health insurance a little bit more, or slightly increase Section 8 housing vouchers. And what we don't need in this country are marginal tweaks to our existing broken system. We need to think about how is it that we can, fundamentally rewrite some of the major rules of the economy to, have an economy that doesn't prioritize short-term profit maximization and unfortunately combusting fossil fuels, and instead prioritizes long-term sustainability of our planet and focus on human well-being instead. And I think that is eminently reasonable and completely feasible from an economic standpoint. And the real question here is, how do we muster the political will?
Yeah, and again, to go back, like especially in the last 50 years, the taking that marginal improvement approach you've talked about, that is the breaking from history, right? That is where things have shifted toward a negative in ways that like we were showing, no matter what the metric you want to look at in terms of improving and making the economy more just, like taking the more bold approach, taking the ensuring economic rights, which was part of what FDR wanted to accomplish. That was the better approach. I was struck reading in the book how it was Roosevelt's 1944 State of the Union that's kind of hatched the entire idea for your book. Roosevelt starts talking about 4 economic rights, and then I think it grows to 8. And he, as you mentioned, he's doing this in the records of the Depression, but also in 1944, we're on the cusp of defeating fascism. We're starting to assess its root cause. How does Roosevelt and 44 start to further the conversation on economic rights?
Yeah, so the timing here is really important. And Roosevelt put forth this notion of economic rights as the culmination of the New Deal, the kind of the cherry on top of his life's work to ensure that the deal was actually done and secured. Now, at the time, the US and the Allies were turning the tide of the war against Nazi Germany, and Roosevelt and his cabinet were finally able to turn their attention back to domestic affairs after focusing, full throttle on the war. And what they wanted to do is ensure a post-war economy that was, structured to serve human needs, to ensure that, instead of building enough, bombers to beat the Germans, that we were building enough houses to make sure everybody had a place to sleep at night, to ensure that we had enough colleges and doctors and nurses to, educate and care for the American population. And so Roosevelt put forth this economic Bill of Rights, not only as a vision, but as something that he called on Congress to enact as soon as possible. Unfortunately, Roosevelt passed just a year after putting this forward and was unable to secure it. But that vision lived on, primarily in the civil rights movement. People like A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and Martin Luther King fought relentlessly for economic rights because they understood that civil rights were inextricably linked for economic rights. The vote was not enough to secure freedom for Black Americans. They needed both, the right to vote and basic economic needs met. And so that fight continued. And, to this day, we unfortunately have failed to secure economic rights for people and really any of them. We still have people going hungry. We still have people going without health insurance. We still have, 500,000 people on any given night here in the United States homeless. And these are issues that we need to think boldly about legislating to fix. And I think that, we have had in the past few years a real moral reckoning with our economy, kind of coming out of the 2008 financial crisis, where you had the Occupy movement calling for an economy of the 99%, right? Now, what did that mean? And people didn't know. We didn't have a 10-point plan. And I think that's okay. People were people were angry, and people were trying to figure out what comes next, what is going to rise out of the ashes of neoliberalism that failed so utterly to provide people with decent and dignified lives. And, that's when I actually decided to look back to our own history to think about, when have we had these conversations before? What were the policies on the table to try to address the challenges that we face, both the last time fascism was on the move, as well as the last time we had a major economic calamity that brought the nation to its knees. And that's what sparked my interest in economic rights, was realizing that this could simultaneously address our economic woes, help solve some of our political challenges. Though I want to be clear, we need major political reforms that would complement the economic rights, and would also help us address climate change. Because look, when people are hungry, when people are worried about, paying rent, they're not going to be thinking about, how do I, pay extra money to insulate my house, even if it has a positive payback over a 5 or 6 year period. They're worried about, how do I take care of myself today and tomorrow? And so, I do think that these crises compound one another.
And the brilliance of the Green New Deal was it didn't separate these economic rights from climate action. It centered how these things are intertwined. The brilliance of the Sunrise Movements, even in its earliest days, the movement leaders were talking about the civil rights movement and how the combination of civil and economic rights, so how you build effective movements. We just had the reintroduction of the Green New Deal. We're now past the 4-year anniversary. When you look back at the introduction to the Green New Deal, what was so important about that policy proposal?
Yeah, the Green New Deal radically changed the discussion about climate change in the United States, and basically exclusively for the better. I mean, first, it helped people wake up to the fact that, what we didn't need, yet again, were marginal tweaks. We didn't just need a small carbon tax and everything would be okay. Maybe if we had enacted something like that back in 1980s, perhaps that could have helped, turn the tide faster. But given where we are here right now, we need kind of transformative policy change that not only moves us away from fossil fuels, but ensures that we protect people's lives and livelihoods in the process of doing that. I mean, large economic transformations are disruptive. Like, we can just look back to NAFTA to think about the last time economists said, don't worry, this transition will work out. Maybe it did work out on the aggregate, but let's not forget that tens of millions of people lost their jobs and did not go get a decent job in turn. And I think we should be equally concerned today about people working in fossil fuels. Just look at what's happening in Kentucky and West Virginia. If people lose, $100,000 a year union job working in a coal mine to go work for $9 an hour at the Motel 8, that is not acceptable. And so we can't leave it up to the market, because the market has proved time and time again that it's incapable of, ensuring decent jobs and livelihoods for all people. So we need, clear policy, which has today become, industrial policy, which everybody's talking about, which is essentially just a form of government, guiding the economy. It's government planning to a degree. So we need that. But what the Green New Deal did that was so exciting is it linked social and climate policy. And it did so precisely because these are inseparable. You can't isolate climate policy in a vacuum and think that we can address our climate problems without at the same time addressing our underlying inequality challenges, because that type of program will fail. We saw this in France as one example. People talk about the Yellow Vest movement as an example of why carbon prices don't work. I disagree with that take. I think the Yellow Vest movement was a good example of why regressive climate policies don't work. Those are very different things. We could have, for instance, a carbon price that simultaneously reduces inequality through the use of a carbon dividend, which I'm sure you all have talked about on the podcast before. But there are ways that we can build broad-based support for addressing our climate problems while simultaneously fixing some of our economic challenges. And what we find in polling is that these policies are popular. People want jobs. If you tell them you're going to take things away, people get a little upset. If you tell people that you are going to build a better future for them while providing them with good jobs in the process, they are thrilled. And that's the vision that the Green New Deal put forth. It was not one of economic, belt tightening in order to address our climate problems. It was not one of climate austerity. It was one of climate abundance. It was a vision to reorient us to a future where, we can decarbonize while all having nice things.
I want to drill down on what you're saying there with the carbon price, because like on conversations like the climate pod, as you might imagine, the kind of 1980s style carbon price that you talked about has really fallen out of favor, especially as we've seen the kind of industrial policy efforts work and become more popular. But then I'm reading in your book your advocacy for what was more of like a carbon cap and dividends, essentially a carbon price, but it's way more progressive. And I was like, I'm really digging this. I was interested in it. Tell me, can you explain what you would like to see if we institute a progressive carbon price?
Yeah. So, I want listeners to understand that the way I think about climate policy is really a three-legged climate policy stool. What we should be leading with is climate investments. And that's precisely what the Inflation Reduction Act is doing, right? We just passed over $300 billion in targeted climate investments here in the US economy. And that's absolutely right. We should be leading with building the green future we need. We simultaneously need smart regulations, climate regulations, to help push the economy in a greener direction. And this is exactly what the Biden administration is doing with the new EPA rules that are coming down the pipeline to help transition both the transportation sector and speed up the transition to electric vehicles, as well as to target power plants and ensure that we start reducing emissions in the electricity sector. So, smart regulations play a really important role here. But, hey, I'm an economist. We do still live in a market economy. Prices do matter. I mean, the energy crisis of last summer, I think, really highlights this. Consumers trying to purchase electric vehicles, or in the very least hybrid vehicles, or just smaller vehicles, went through the roof. Nobody wanted an SUV or truck anymore when gas was $5 a gallon. Prices matter. And so I do think that we should indeed have a carbon price in the United States. But the key question here is kind of twofold. One is, how do you set the price? And then two is, what happens to the money? And this is where I differ substantially with most other economists in advocating for what I call a carbon cap and dividend system. So why a carbon cap over a carbon price? Let's say we have a carbon price of $50 per ton of carbon dioxide, or even $100. We do not know how much that will reduce emissions by. And that, a carbon price provides us price certainty, but emissions uncertainty. And given that we're trying to reduce emissions by a given percentage every year to meet our climate goals set out in the Paris Climate Accords, that's a problem. On the flip side, if we implement a carbon cap where we say reduce emissions by roughly 7 to 8% a year, which is what we would need to do to meet our carbon neutral goal by 2050, then we actually have emission certainty. We know exactly how much we'd be reducing emissions per year. And the carbon cap is simply an insurance policy for the climate. It's there to say, look, if the investments and regulations that we pass aren't enough, then the carbon cap will kick in and ensure that we meet our emissions goals. And I think that's fairly important. Let's lead with the investments, but let's put a carbon cap in place to ensure that we actually don't blow past the 1.5 to 2 degree target that we've already agreed to, and that President Biden has repeatedly promised to adhere to. Now, what happens with the money? If we take that money and give it back to the American people on equal per capita measure, everybody gets a check for the same amount of money every single month, we're essentially creating a green basic income that will protect the purchasing power of the bottom 70% of Americans. In other words, those living in the bottom 70% will not only see a cleaner and healthier environment, but they have to pay nothing to address climate change. In fact, they'll end up with more money in their pockets at the end of the day. It's only the very high polluters, which tend to be the very wealthy people, that will pay more in the carbon tax than they will get back through their dividend. And so this essentially creates a progressive carbon price that protects the purchasing power of most Americans while punishing the wealthiest people who tend to be by far the biggest polluters.
It makes a ton of sense, and I love that you outlined it in the book. Another thing that makes a ton of sense if we're going to combat the climate crisis is putting more people to work. And this has just been something that worked incredibly well during the New Deal era. We had the Civilian Conservation Corps, and now it was in the Build Back Better plan. This is something the Sunrise Movement has been pushing for. And so many others have wanted this Civilian Climate Corps. We haven't gotten it, but what can we learn from the past to influence how government in the United States puts people to work on climate action?
This is such an important question. It's something that I am just deeply frustrated by at the moment. I had the wonderful privilege of working with the Sunrise Movement and Senator Markey's office in developing the Civilian Climate Corps that was originally in Build Back Better, but unfortunately was stripped out. And I think that was a real lost opportunity. But it was a policy that at the time we just didn't have the sufficient political support to get passed. And when we look at our existing country, we can see two things. One is the beautiful wonders that the original Civilian Conservation Corps built. I'm a national park buff. In fact, last year I went to about 20 national parks, which was just a huge pleasure. We live in a stunning country. And the Civilian Conservation Corps helped ensure that natural beauty was accessible to the American people. They built bridges and roads and trails and really helped ensure that it was preserved for generations to come. And the amazing thing is how much of their work is still standing in amazing condition, 90 years later. And today the youth are hungry to do the same. They're hungry to, invest in nature, and they're hungry to, invest in the climate transition. I mean, look, this is not a representative poll, but I was curious. I asked my students, I said, hey, how many of you would go work for the Climate Corps for $15 an hour, take a year or two off before you go into the workforce? And about 80% of my students' hands jump up right away. I mean, the young people are hungry to contribute. And I think it's a shame that we don't give them, an access route to national service. Sure, we have, the military, but a lot of people don't want to go join the military. They want to go build rather than destroy. And instead, we choose to subsidize violence over subsidizing, investments in our built environment.
You detail the success in the end of the Civil Works administration in the New Deal era. What was the Civil Works administration and how successful was it?
So the Civil Works Administration is the predecessor to the Works Progress Administration, with which most listeners are more familiar with. The Civil Works Administration was the original, essentially, job guarantee program here in the United States. And when Roosevelt came into office, we had a crisis with well north of 20% of Americans unemployed. And so Roosevelt tasked Harry Hopkins, one of his cabinet members and a social worker, to create a program that would put people to work and do it fast. And what Hopkins came up with was the CWA, and that program put roughly 10% of Americans to work, 4 million Americans to work within just 2 months. And yes, they were building things like roads and bridges and digging ditches and irrigation canals, but they were also doing things like, opening up closed down factories in, the winter in the north to create, free long underwear for people that had lost their jobs and all of a sudden couldn't purchase anything. So everybody in Michigan, anybody who wanted one, got free long underwear from the government. They were producing basic goods and services for free for the people by, putting folks to work and doing that in a way that, they would be contributing something productive for society. It was a massively successful program, both in terms of the things that were produced, as well as in the employment it created. And when we look at its predecessor, the Works Progress Administration, it employed over 9.5 million people over the duration of its lifetime, building almost 40,000 schools, 8,000 parks across the country, more than 4,000 utility plants. These are things that we continue to benefit here and now. So the national service, I think, has been a wonderful part of American history that I'd like to see us bring back.
And it's a critical part of getting to that federal job guarantee you're talking about, which, as you mentioned, is extremely popular among people when they're polled. It has a long history. No, not the federal job guarantee, but putting people to work has a long history of creating a boom to the economy. In addition to adding the exact security you were talking about, that's so critical to human flourishing. And as you talk about in the book, I'll quote here that, quote, work in the 21st century is an antagonist to freedom, unquote. You talk about these private government constraints, which is really eye-opening to think about in the book. What are private government constraints that we're experiencing now?
Yeah. So earlier in the conversation, we talked about the notion of negative freedom, freedom from coercion. And so when we look at, the current neoliberal order that we're all living in, we can ask, has it successfully, limited coercion? And the fact is that the neoliberal idea has completely failed on its own terms when we account for the fact that most people spend 47 hours actually a week here in the United States on average working in mini dictatorships in their jobs. And so private government is this idea that employers have a tremendous amount of free reign over how they treat their employees, ranging from things to controlling their speech to being able to control who they date and having the right in many states to fire them depending on who they're dating. And it is really a troubling situation where, workers are coerced on a daily basis. So even on its own terrain, neoliberalism is utterly failing. And this idea of private government is an idea I borrow from the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson, who is just a really brilliant thinker in helping us think about kind of the modern day exploitation and what to do about it. Now, one of the reasons that I'm such a strong proponent of a job guarantee is because it actually gives people an exit option if they have a bad boss. You have a boss that is treating you poorly, whether that's verbal abuse or scheduling abuse or perhaps sexual abuse. Unfortunately today, many people can't just leave their job and go get another well-paying job. There's always unemployment. Employers intentionally ensure that unemployment is always in existence so that they can keep workers in line. But the job guarantee essentially creates a real true fallback position for workers where they can always exit current employment and go get a decent job at the government with health insurance, with retirement benefits and the like. And when we talk to American voters, we find that a job guarantee is wildly popular. I mean, a 2020 Gallup poll during the COVID-19 crisis found 93% direct support for direct job creation, including 87% of Republicans. We polled folks again more recently in collaboration with Data for Progress, and we found yet again extremely high support, not quite as high as was found during the 2020 crisis, but that's normal. What you tend to see is support for social programs fall a little bit when the economy is doing really well. Nevertheless, a majority of independents and Republicans still support direct job creation because it's not a left or right issue. If people are willing and able to work and the market's not willing to provide them a job at a decent wage, everybody understands that that's a market failure. Everybody understands that that's wrong and that we need to do something about it. If people want to contribute to our society, they should be able to, and they should be paid a decent wage for it.
Absolutely. As you talked about before, as you talked about a lot in the book, they should also be able to afford a house. And if we had more if the federal government took a larger role in providing housing and ensuring that everyone had the right to make a fair living wage and have a job where they could afford to buy a home, that one, it would be great for the economy. There's an immoral imperative to provide that pathway. And also, just from a very like a specific climate lens, this would create an incredible opportunity to help further our decarbonization efforts. When you look at a guaranteeing housing, how might that help us decarbonize?
So buildings account for 40% of electricity use here in America. I mean, our building stock is tremendously energy intensive. Part of that is because we live in a very diverse climate where those in the South need to cool their buildings, and those in the North, like me, need to heat our buildings in the wintertime to stay warm. And unfortunately, our building stock is fairly old and outdated, and very energy inefficient. And so through having both a job guarantee type program as well as a homes guarantee to build new housing, it would set us on a path to decarbonize the existing housing stock while simultaneously investing in our new net zero housing stock. And this would help in a number of different ways. So, first of all, is just training up a huge set of workers. I mean, we do have a legitimate challenge right now where we don't have enough workers trained in, net zero building, whether those are electricians to install the heat pumps we need, or, well-trained insulators to ensure, building envelopes are incredibly airtight. We do need to train up those workers, and the best way to train workers is on the job. And so these programs, together could help get that process started. The other thing is that, costs increasingly come down through learning by doing. So as the government invests in building carbon-free housing, the future cost to private homeowners of doing that on their own will be lesser. I mean, we're seeing this right now with electric vehicles, for example, where 10 years ago, electric vehicles were substantially more expensive than they are today. Today, electric vehicles on average are cheaper than internal combustion engines already. So it's a really exciting time to see costs coming down quite quickly. And this program, I think, will help tremendously with that effort.
Thing that you will hear all over mainstream media. You'll hear this in conversations, and it makes your brain want to explode, is what you talk about in the book, is public spending is less efficient than private spending. This is something that just gets thrown around as it's an absolute truth, but you debunk this in the book. Why is this, Dr. Paul, a fallacy?
Yeah, it's a really wild situation when you dig into the details. So, look, I love reading technical appendices, and I understand not everybody's into that. But one day I decided to look at the technical appendices of the Congressional Budget Office. They're essentially the scorekeepers in Washington, D.C. You want to pass a bill, be it a climate bill or anything else, they tally up all the numbers and tell you how much this will cost the economy. And what I found was, in their assumptions, they simply assume de facto that public spending is half as productive as private spending. Now, let me be clear. The empirical literature does not even come close to supporting this. In fact, the empirical literature tends to find that public spending is just as productive, if not more productive, than private spending. Let me give you just one example: is investment in kids. I mean, investment in the education of America's youth tends to return $8 to $9 per dollar invested. I mean, it's a tremendous return. Now, when we talk about public spending, we shouldn't only be concerned with return on investment. We should also be concerned is this the right thing to do? Is this the direction we want to put our economy in? When we talk about feeding children or housing human beings, the first question on our minds should not be, is the return on investment good? The first question is, can we afford to do this? But part of answering, can we afford to do this, is the return on investment question, because it ensures that we do these things in a sustainable fashion. And so what economists are increasingly realizing is that public spending is crucial to a healthy economy. And in fact, what we saw in the 2020 COVID crisis really proved this point, where we had stimulus money, public spending, pour into the economy and ensure that we had the quickest economic recovery ever seen here in the United States. I mean, after the 2008 financial crisis, when the government pulled back too early on public spending, it took us 10 years to regain the jobs lost. Here in 2020, what we saw is following the crisis, it took us just 2 years to regain all the jobs lost. That is a lot of people that didn't have to go through years of immiseration and unemployment and economic struggles.
You go right at the question of how do we pay for this? How do we finance an economic bill of rights? We can't get into all the details on this conversation. This is one of the reasons why people need to buy the book and to dig into this. But what are the fundamentals of how you structure financing an economic bill of rights?
It's the $1 trillion question, or in the case of addressing economic rights plus the climate crisis. I mean, we're talking many, many trillions of dollars. I don't want to fool people. This is not going to be cheap, but that's okay. And when we ask this question, how are we going to pay for it? I think it's really important we separate the question into two pieces. First is, where will the dollars come from? And we need to take that seriously. And second is, where will the real resources come from? So when we're talking about climate change, who's going to pay for the solar panels, but then also, where is the silicone going to come from? Where's the steel going to come from to create the wind turbines? And the real resource question, I contend in the book, is the more challenging one. Kind of coming up with the money is the easy part. So let me talk about that part first, because I think that's the part that actually scares most people. There's three places that the money is going to come from. First, and I don't want to kid folks, our taxes likely will go up, but that's not a bad thing. Taxes going up doesn't make you worse off. The real question is, how much money do you have in your pocket at the end of the day once basic things are taken care of? Your rent is paid, or your mortgage for that matter, you have health insurance and the like. Let me use myself as an example. I have a good job, and here I am paying $830 a month for health insurance. That is a lot of money. Now, if my tax bill goes up $500 a month, but all of a sudden I have access to universal health care and I no longer need to pay healthcare premiums, let alone copays and deductibles, then I am better off, right? Tax bill goes up $500 a month, but I don't have to pay that $830 a month in my healthcare premiums. I am financially better off, not to mention that I'll have better health insurance. And so taxes can go up while also increasing the amount of money that are in most people's pockets. So that is completely feasible. And in fact, when you crunch the numbers, that's exactly what would happen under a Medicare for All type program. The second thing is that we need to reorient our national priorities. I mean, right now we spend far too much money on things like subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, which we do to the tune of tens of billions of dollars a year, and far too little on investing in human beings, whether that's building homes for the homeless or decarbonizing every single federal building as quickly as possible, and also transitioning the federal transportation fleet over to all electric vehicles, just to give a few examples. So we need to change how we spend our existing money. And the third thing that I think is really important for us to consider is substantially increasing taxes on the wealthiest Americans. Now, this wouldn't only create more, economic space to engage in additional federal spending for our priorities under our economic rights, but it would also help protect our democracy itself. I mean, the wealthiest Americans, the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musks of the world, are detrimental to the functioning of our democratic system. I mean, Thomas Paine, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the most radical of the founding fathers, went so far as to argue that some degree of economic equality is a necessity for a well-functioning democracy. And I agree. And so, one of the best ways to get money out of politics is ensure that, we don't have billionaires walking around with undue economic and political power. And so that's a really important component. Now, the more challenging part is precisely figuring out how we're going to get all the real resources to do this. We're going to have to train a lot more nurses, a lot more teachers, a lot more electricians, and construction workers. But I think we can do it. We've done it before in instances like World War II, where we completely retooled our economy to defeat fascism. And I'm convinced we can do it again here today. But I think those are the real struggles that we need to be dealing with, rather than being concerned about how do we come up with the money. I think that's the easy part of the equation.
You talk about in the book that, quote, public spending on decarbonization will raise wages and living standards for the masses while promoting full employment, public health, and economic stability, unquote. You just mentioned World War II. Do you think that combating the climate crisis can serve as like a central organizing effort to help us achieve many of the Bill of Rights you're talking about?
I do, because today all policy is climate policy. I mean, most things in our lives use carbon emissions, whether we're talking about housing, whether we're talking about transportation, whether we're talking about our energy infrastructure. I mean, carbon is essential to our built environment here today. And so we can use the energy crisis actually as an opportunity to retool our economy in a way that will help deliver our economic rights, build sufficient housing for everybody, build, schools and decarbonize existing schools, and do these things in a manner that ensures that, no longer are people unemployed and no longer are people hungry. So yeah, I think that the climate crisis is an excellent catalyzing event to help us, reorient. I mean, often we need a common enemy to bring us together. And I think the climate crisis could be that common enemy. The concern here is that unfortunately the Republican Party has chosen to be as obstructionist as possible, and really is just going full throated against decarbonization efforts, despite the fact that decarbonization efforts are massively benefiting their constituents. I mean, most Inflation Reduction Act dollars so far are flowing to Republican congressional districts. Now, the funny thing here that I think is really important for us to continue to struggle with is that, rank and file Republicans want climate investment. It's their elected officials in Washington that are pushing against their best interests, both their best interests in terms of creating jobs for them, and also their best interests in terms of creating a sustainable and healthy environment. And so, we need to think more creatively about how to change some minds in the voting booth in order to, build increasing political power.
No, you're absolutely right. And I was thinking, when people read this book, they're going to realize how what a talented economist you are. Also, what a historian that you are. But also, we've known you on the Climate Pod for years because you're a real climate economist. And I'm just, if people are going to be able to pick this book up, no matter what interests they have in American public policy, what got you passionate about working on the climate crisis with your expertise?
So for me, it actually all started in the restaurants. I grew up working in restaurants since I was 14. I love cooking. And I, started asking questions about where our food was coming from, and looking at the food system. And, next thing I knew, I got really into gardening and organic agriculture and trying to understand, the environmental costs of our modern day food system. And that sent me down kind of the climate change wormhole, as a matter of fact, because I realized that climate change was going to just drastically destabilize our food system. And look, I try to study in my career the biggest challenges that I think we collectively face. And that's precisely why I ended up studying inequality and climate change. And these two ideas are inextricably linked, which is, exactly why the climate crisis poses, both a systemic threat to our well-being, but also an opportunity for us to really rethink how we structure our economy, why, and most importantly, to what ends. And I've really enjoyed in my career as an economist working on these issues. Although, let me tell you, I really hope to one day be able to not think about such troubling issues. I want to live in a carbon-free economy. I want to live in a fairly egalitarian society. I mean, most of us do. When you ask American people if they want, things like a healthy environment, they absolutely say yes, including independents and Republicans. When you ask people if they want to live in an unequal society, what's interesting is they do tell you, yeah, people who they think work really hard should have a bit more, but they don't want to live in a society anywhere near as unequal as the one we have here today. And so those are the conversations I want to turn us towards in the future, is thinking about, what is the society we want to build? We've had, far too many books that critique our existing system, but we need more people talking about what does the future actually hold? What is that North Star that we should be working towards? And that's precisely what I try to do with this book.
One of the few things that make me optimistic about where we could potentially be heading is the success of the American left in recent years, and how we're going back to the history that you write about with, implementing, like we were talking about with the Sunrise Movement, like studying the civil rights movement for learning how to integrate, climate action, economic rights with civil liberties, right? And guaranteeing civil rights and combating racial inequality, going back to the job successes of the New Deal and looking at how we can apply that to something like you mentioned, the Civilian Climate Corps. There's so much through our history that we can learn from and also inspire a new American left. And I was like, I was writing about Occupy before I was, podcasting about the climate crisis. Like I definitely got into this more from an interest in the history of the American left than anything else. And you write about some of the big changes that you've seen from the Green New Deal to the candidacy of Bernie Sanders to even the evolution on some of the ways that President Joe Biden talks about economic rights versus what he was saying, decades ago. I guess when you look at all of the movements happening to make something like an economic bill of rights a possibility, like what gives you a sense that we could see progress in the near future?
I am incredibly optimistic right now, although there's definitely some real fear sprinkled in. And that fear comes less because I think that the American people are poised for change, and more because the Republicans are really good at gerrymandering. And so, let's talk about this optimism, because the country has been experiencing political change and shifts in our political landscape far faster than, we've seen in our lifetimes. I mean, we had a Democratic Socialist almost secure the Democratic nomination. And, I think without serious obstruction from the DNC, he, likely would have. We have multiple DSA members in Congress here today that are putting forth, visions to ensure that we decarbonize schools through the Green New Deal for public schools that Jamal Bowman has introduced, for one example, or, visions for a economically prosperous and climate stable future, such as outlined in the Green New Deal resolution that was just reintroduced last week in Congress. So, we are at a moment where we have elected officials in office that I think are fighting for real systemic change, both in Washington and in our economy writ large. And it is exciting. I mean, even Joe Biden, who, look, I didn't vote for him in the primary, not even close. But here we have a president that was pulled to the left on some issues in the general, right? After he secured the nomination, he came to the left to secure the Democratic vote. Usually you have, people come to the center once they've secured the nomination. And we saw the opposite happen with President Biden. I think that was a positive sign of the real power of the left here in this country. But I don't want to fool us and say the job's done, because we're really just getting started. There's a tremendous amount of work to be done. So people ask me all the time, if I want to offset my carbon emissions, what do I do? And there's, so many companies that engage in gimmick and schemes. And what I always say is get involved politically. That's the best thing you can actually do. You want to reduce your carbon emissions? We need systemic change. And that means getting involved politically, whether that's donating your time or your money to real climate champions in Congress, because that's how we continue to create the optimism and change that we need here.
And if you want a base of knowledge to understand the history of these movements, the need for what we have with an economic bill of rights, and how to understand the solutions better, I can make no better recommendation than to buy The Ends of Freedom: Reclaiming America's Lost Promise of Economic Rights. Dr. Mark Paul, thank you so much for this lengthy and incredibly interesting conversation.
It's been such a pleasure.